Okay, final chapter of Unit 5, which is Chapter 15, Augmented Feedback. So if we look at the term augmented feedback, we're looking at providing information to a person that is going to further improve their performance and further improve the way that they are able to process information so they can get better faster. So that is kind of the term augmented feedback, or facilitating skill learning. So if we look at a couple components here, we're going to be looking at task intrinsic feedback, which is stuff that we've already talked about pretty extensively in this course. So things like touch, or proprioception, and vision. And then we're going to be looking at augmented feedback, which is kind of referring to the enhancement of the feedback itself, so it helps someone improve and get better over time. So let's talk about the feedback family. This is basically implying about the things that we've talked about in the past, in Chapter 6 in particular, and then also the things we're going to talk about in this chapter, Chapter 15, and it helps you kind of break down these components. So you're going to get certain feedback that is task intrinsic, such as the things that you take in visually, things that you hear, things that you feel, both from a proprioceptive standpoint and from a tactile standpoint. So those are those task intrinsic things. When we look at augmented feedback, we're going to be talking about your KR and your KP. So your KR is your knowledge of results, your KP is your knowledge of performance. Now, should be relatively straightforward to break those things down. We'll kind of talk about what they are in more detail. The first type of augmented feedback is your knowledge of results. So this is basically telling the performer whether he or she has achieved the performance goal. So it is externally present. That is an external feedback that you receive by knowing if you actually achieved the outcome or not. Conversely, we have knowledge of performance. So this is the information about the movement characteristics that led to the outcome. So how did you move that made that outcome become apparent? So if we go into these examples here at table 15.1, the first example, of course, because it's golf, I'm going to talk about it, is that your KR, or your knowledge of result, is that your shot went into the right rough. So that is the result. That's what happened. That's the outcome. However, your performance says, like, what did you do that made that happen? So the instructor says, hey, you did not take your backswing far enough back before you began your downswing. That created your shot going to the right, right? You need to know about that information in order to improve your performance so that you can get a better result. So knowing about your results is great, like understanding, okay, what did I do? That's awesome, but you also want to understand what your performance is too, so that you can further improve that and get a better result next time. So what are the roles of augmented feedback in skill acquisition? So augmented feedback plays two roles. One is to facilitate achievement of the action goal of skill, and the second part is to motivate the learner to continue striving towards a goal. So obviously you want to further improve someone's capacity to accomplish the goal. So you want to give them little pieces of feedback that help them understand where their errors are made, but you also want to give them feedback that encourages them for doing the correct things as well, because that helps push them forward and say, hey, I want you to keep doing that thing over and over and over. So if we move forward here, we're going to get into the content of augmented feedback. What should be included? And so this is kind of what I just talked about, is the information about errors versus information about correct aspects of performance. So the research consistently shows that information is more effective when you provide information about the error that they make. So, you know, it's just like in the last chapter when I talked about walking and the person who can't put their heel on the ground. you want to encourage that person to correct that error. You want to say, hey, get your heel on the ground, get your heel on the ground. Keep repeating that, keep noting that error, because that helps their performance. However, there are times when you just talk about errors, that can be very discouraging to a person. So you want to make sure that that person also is getting encouraged for the good things they're doing. So there are times when I see the person who can't put their heel on the ground, they may not do it perfectly, but I still give them encouragement, say, hey, that was a better job putting your foot on the floor, right? Maybe you didn't quite get your heel down properly, but I liked what you're doing here. Oh, that's more symmetrical, that's more smooth, right? It's not as choppy, they're not limping as much. So you want to give both that error information, which we know is very effective, but we also want to give some of this facilitative information that motivates them. So correct performance information motivates a person. Error detection and error-related information works better to facilitate skill acquisition. So make sure you break those two components down. Augmented feedback doesn't always just have to be about errors. So now we're going to talk about KR versus KP, and I think people that kind of say, hey, like, which one's more valuable? And it seems like the obvious one is that KP, right? Knowledge of performance. Hey, what did I do that made this good or bad? But what we found is that they're both valuable, right? Obviously, the performance itself, those are things that you want people to be able to do more effectively because it pertains to your outcome. It pertains to your result. But I also kind of say to, if you're still executing something well and it's getting you the result that you want, even if it doesn't look amazing, like not everyone has the most beautiful jump shot in the world, but if they keep making it, it doesn't really matter. So those are kind of things when you want to say, as long as you're accomplishing the result and you're doing it semi-efficiently and it's effective for you, that could be really, really important just to say, hey, you're getting the result you want. But if they're doing things that are creating more errors, you're going to want to give that knowledge of performance back to that person. So there's some research where they found there's no support for practice conditions that promote errorless learning. Errors during practice enhance motor learning processes. So we want there to be mistakes, obviously not to a ridiculous degree, but we want there to be practice where someone has to make some mistakes. And if they can make mistakes, that allows them to help correct them when they do get in a more working environment, such as a game or more game-like scenarios in practice. It's just going to help them in those scenarios. So errorless practice is not super well supported. It has its place, but it's not something that we generally encourage a ton of all the time. So make sure that when you do put someone in a practice environment, that there is an opportunity to make some mistakes, because that's going to help them learn. So next, we can talk about augmented feedback based on error sizes. So when we provide feedback, we want to do it at strategic times, right? Like, we don't want to be nitpicky, but we also don't want to be complacent. We don't want to be completely ignorant to errors. We want to take into consideration these performance bandwidths. So when we think about a bandwidth, we are trying to say, how much of a mistake do I want to see before I give feedback, right? Like, what percentage of error do I want to see before I say, hey, you know what, I've seen you do this a few times, I want to correct you now. And that's valuable, because you want the person to also not have to rely on the instructor to make those corrections, right? If they're doing it over and over and over and they keep making a 10 or 20% error, you're going to want to come back in there and say, hey, this is what I want to see, or I want you to do a little bit more of this. And that's going to help them learn. instead of pointing out every single thing that they do wrong, or conversely, not pointing anything out at all and just saying, just do what you're doing. So that's where a performance bandwidth can be useful to provide augmented feedback when it's necessary and not doing it all the time. Okay, next is the types of knowledge performance. So this is the types of KP that we're going to give to people, right? And a lot of the things that we do in feedback, if we look back, is what are the types of feedback? Well, there's visual, there's auditory, there is verbal, right? There's little different types of feedback we can get. So let's talk about verbal KP. So one of the reasons why practitioners, or like let's say a physiotherapist, gives more verbal KP than verbal KR is that knowledge of performance gives people more information to help them improve the movement characteristics that underlie skilled performance. One of the problems that arises with the use of verbal KP is determining the appropriate content. So what do you tell the person who's performing the skill? So the challenge for instructors or therapists is then selecting the appropriate features of the performance on which to base KP. So this is something that I think I run into almost every day in the clinic. It's like we want somebody to perform a skill. We don't want to provide too much feedback and make the person feel like they can't do it at all. But we also want to focus on very distinct parts of the skill and that allow them to be successful. So again, if I refer back to my patient who won't put their heel in the ground, I don't want to be giving feedback all the time. I need to hold back every so often and do that. And I make mistakes with this all the time. I'm far from perfect. You have to pick and choose your battles, and it's going to depend on the type of person who's sitting in front of you too. We have certain people, and I have patients who do this, where sometimes I don't give feedback, and they're asking me, am I doing this right? And I'm thinking, yeah, you are. It's like, that's why I'm not giving you feedback, when maybe I should be encouraging them. I should be like, hey, you're doing that correctly. And then I have other people who you'll say something to them, and then they get really hyper-focused on it. And they're like, well, what about this mistake? Or, oh, am I doing this correctly? And, oh, I'm worried that I'm not doing that properly. And you don't want to have that either, because then that becomes an environment where the person's they're not open to making mistakes. They're more concerned about the errors they're making instead of just embracing the movement. So again, verbal KP is an important component of augmented feedback, but we also don't want to be overkill and make someone discouraged, or also be underkilling and the person not receiving any feedback at all. Next is manual guidance. So manual guidance is just when you are physically moving someone in a particular way, right? So, if you're kind of moving someone's arm around to get them to do a certain motion, again, we do this in the clinic all the time. Be like, hey, I want your body to do this, and you kind of guide their hips, or you guide their shoulder, or their arm, or their leg, and you're trying to get them to kind of understand a movement pattern that allows them to execute that motion correctly. Same thing is like in golf. We see people do this all the time. They'll stand in front of a person or beside a person and like move their arms or move their body. Like, hey, I want you to feel this when you do this motion. And that gives them some tactile feedback. It gives them some movement feedback so that they can feel what it should be like and not be guessing based on just what you're telling them. Because sometimes we need to actually put that person in the position you want in order to get the proper feedback that they need. Next is video recordings. So this is becoming more and more popular as days go by, is people getting video feedback. I know from watching, working with hockey teams that I do, there's a lot more visual feedback and a lot more video that's being provided to people, because it provides some benefit to the skill level of that particular learner and allows them to see what they're doing from a third person view. So for beginners to benefit from video, they require the assistance of an instructor to point out critical information. When you're more advanced, you don't need the instructor to help you as frequently, but discussions can be very helpful, right? So if you're really good at a sport, you just need to look at the video and be like, oh man, I messed up there. I need to see more information. I need to see a better play in that certain scenario, or versus a beginner who doesn't really know what mistakes they're looking for. So that's kind of the biggest thing when we're looking at video recordings as augmented feedback. And I think that's a super useful thing. And that's why I've had you guys do that as part of your final project. So you can go back and be like, oh, these are the errors I was making. Here's the progress I've made over time. It allows you to visually see it. Okay, the very last thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is biofeedback. And again, this is something that's used relatively frequently in the rehab space. It's fallen a little bit out of favor in the research recently, but can still be useful. And the idea of biofeedback is to use an EMG to monitor how much muscle activity there is for a certain motion, right? So if you can get someone to use an EMG, you can monitor how much or how little of a muscle that you're using for a particular skill. And that can help give you feedback to say, well, I'm doing this correctly, or maybe we want to see more out of that muscle. It's like, hey, I want you to feel like you're contracting that a little bit harder as you do it. And that can help give people some feedback as well. So if we're breaking back down augmented feedback, we're looking at things that you can do physically, so like biofeedback, right? We're also looking at tactile feedback or video as a means of being some visual components, right? We're looking at how someone can manually guide you through motion. We're also looking at verbal knowledge of performance as well. So when you're providing feedback to someone, it's not just verbal, right? It can be given to people in multitudes of different ways, either verbally, visually, or tactilely to that person. So make sure that when you are going to teach someone something or you're learning something yourself, that you have multiple ways of absorbing the information. And that will help you have the most integrated learning environment for acquiring a new skill. But that is the end of Unit 5. So Chapter 14 and 15. Please, again, don't forget to do your chapter reviews for these chapters. It's free marks. Please go get them. I want you guys to do as well as you possibly can from a grade perspective in this course. Your final project will be coming up relatively quickly as well, so please don't ignore that. Please start picking away at that, and if you have any questions, I'm going to start turning the in-person classes into a time to start working on your final project and start asking questions about it as well. So be happy to help you guys if you need. And we have one more unit to go. So the last 4 chapters of the semester, and then final project to go, and then you guys will be done for the year. So we're looking forward for April to start rolling around for you guys. So we'll see you in the next video for chapter 16.